Chapter 7, Selection and Development, Part 2. In this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the qualifications that are common for employment with most police departments and law enforcement agencies, and we're going to talk a little bit about the typical employment application process. So first of all, employment qualifications. One of the important things with for any job, but obviously true for policing, or especially true for policing because it's a public agency and it's governed by even more regulations than many other employers, is the question of whether the qualifications for policing, and what we mean by qualifications are the requirements for that particular job. So with this first phrase here, the bona fide occupational qualification, BFOQ, what that phrase refers to is the job requirement, the qualification, and it could be things like I have listed here, like education, age, physical ability, clean criminal record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever the qualification is it necessary for the job? Is it relevant to the job? But also, does it cause a disparate impact? Does it produce a disparate impact to an identifiable group? And what I mean by disparate impact is, does it more harshly fall upon or limit one group over another? So for instance, let's take one that's really pretty obvious. If we have a physical agility and ability test, so if you have to do a basic physical test to become a police officer, that is going to impact in a negative way. So it's going to have a disparate impact on people who have physical disabilities. And so that doesn't mean that we can't have that physical test, but this can open the door for a lawsuit that particular physical fitness test has having a disparate impact on individuals who have disabilities, physical disabilities, versus people who don't. And so this doesn't mean that we have to do away with that requirement, that qualification, but it does raise a red flag. And so someone who belongs to that group, someone who's physically disabled or physically handicapped, that person, and most likely a group of persons, could bring a lawsuit claiming that this is not a bona fide occupational qualification. What bona fide means is good faith. So it's not a good faith occupational qualification. There's a problem with it. It needs to be either removed or it needs to be modified. And so when such a lawsuit is brought, when there's a group, and it could be, it's not just people who have physical disabilities, it could be it could be based on gender. Maybe as we'll see in a second, we could have a requirement that discriminates against women. If more women are failing to get employed because of this qualification than men. And so, or maybe it's based on race, or maybe it's based on age, or any variety of things. If it has a disparate impact, meaning if it has a harsher, a more negative impact on one group or another, if that group brings a lawsuit and challenges that qualification, then the question becomes, is the qualification necessary? So even if it is having a harsher impact on one group than another, the qualification could still be valid because it's necessary for the job. And so that's what's happened with the physical agility test, generally. If someone who is maybe in a wheelchair, who's paralyzed, if that person sues to be allowed to become a police officer, and to eliminate the physical agility test, the police could still say, physical readiness is a part of policing. If you're going to have to start most likely as a patrol officer, and if so, you're going to be encountering situations where they are not ADA compliant, so they aren't handicapped accessible. You're going to have to go upstairs, perhaps. You're going to have to go over rough terrain where maybe if you're in a wheelchair, you're not going to be able to do that. You may have to chase down a suspect. You may have to struggle with a suspect. So there could be lawsuits brought under various federal acts that could try to force the police to hire you in a different capacity, so maybe you could still be a police officer, but not necessarily be on traditional patrol. But in terms of bona fide occupational qualifications, those physical tests have been mostly upheld. Now, particular parts of the physical ability test, we'll talk about that in a second, those have been struck down. But generally speaking, most, if not all, police departments do require you to pass a physical test. And those have been upheld by the courts. Even if they have a disparate impact on certain groups, nevertheless, they're necessary for policing. So that's really going to be the test. Is this thing relevant to policing? Is it necessary? So if it is necessary, then it's a BFOQ, meaning it's a valid, bona fide occupational qualification. The police can use it to determine who gets employed and who doesn't. If not, so if it's not necessary for the job, if it is having a discriminatory effect and it's not really relevant to the job, then the courts will either order the police department to eliminate that requirement or to modify it. And so that has been done with some of these physical tests. So, for instance, the Pennsylvania State Police were challenged by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has what's known as the 4/5 rule, and what that essentially says is if a particular qualification results in one group passing the qualification more than 80% of the time, more than 4/5 of the time, while another group is failing at a lower than 80% rate, then that's, on the face of it, evidence of a disparate impact. And so then when challenged, the department is going to have to show that that this requirement is necessary. So what was happening with the Pennsylvania State Police physical requirements, before you can go very far in the process, you have to take a physical fitness test for the state police. And it's, the recruiters are all, Pennsylvania State Police recruiters come into my class every semester, and they even admit that it's a joke. When you go to the Pennsylvania State Police Academy and actually go through the training, if you make it that far, you're going to be doing a significantly more demanding physical activity. But to get into the Pennsylvania State Police, to even go start really at the beginning of the application process, you have to show the most basic level of physical fitness. Even at my age, I think I could pass these tests, because you have to do a 1.5 mile run in 18 minutes. So that's, almost walking. That's a little bit faster than walking. You probably could walk for part of it and run for just a little bit of it and still make 18-minute 1.5 mile. You have to do, if memory serves me right, something like a dozen push-ups, and there's really no time limit. So you can take breaks in between and still complete it. You have to have a 14-inch vertical jump, which is not very much. It's a little over a foot off the ground. You're not qualifying for the NBA with that kind of jump. You have to do a certain number of sit-ups, and it's not very much. They're not very much. So, basically, if you're breathing, you should be able to pass this test. But what they found is men are passing it at about 90% or above, while women, even though these requirements are published online and they could train for an 18-minute 1.5 mile run, they're only passing at about 75%. So they're close to that 80%. Well, the Department of Justice brought a lawsuit against Pennsylvania State Police saying, we think this is discriminatory against the women. You need to change your physical requirement. The state police stood up to that and resisted and said, we're not getting rid of this requirement. It's necessary. Because if they can't pass this ridiculous physical test, ridiculously easy physical test, they're never going to make it through the academy, and we're going to waste money on them. We're going to give a valuable academy spot to a person who's never going to make it. Because once they get in the academy, they're going to be doing 5-mile runs. They're not going to be doing 1.5 miles in 18 minutes. They're going to be doing 5-mile runs. They're going to be doing 1,000,000 push-ups. They're going to be swimming, all kinds of things. So Pennsylvania State Police resisted, and the Department of Justice eventually backed off on the lawsuit. But that's just an example. But certainly qualifications have been used to exclude candidates. So clearest example was not state, but police departments generally used to require that applicants be a certain height. And so what they essentially did was they said, okay, what's the average height of a woman? Now let's take that height and maybe set it even an inch higher or somewhere around there. So let's say at the time, and let's go back about 50 years, maybe the average height of a woman was about 5'3", let's say, 5'2", 5'3". They would set that as the minimum height requirement to get the job. So you were going to exclude the great, by definition, you were going to exclude 50% of women generally, but probably even more because when you measured them, maybe you wouldn't measure them real accurately. So even if they were 5'5", you would still list them as 5'3" and disqualify them. And if a man came in who was 5'2", he would suddenly, when you measured him, grow a couple inches. So again, there are all kinds of underhanded things just to keep women out. Eventually the court said, what's the connection between height and policing? Test people physically if you want to, but someone who's 5 feet tall can do the job just as well as someone who's 6'2". So the courts generally struck this down because they realized this was a way to exclude women. And even with the physical ability test, those have dramatically changed over the years. They used to really emphasize upper body strength. And so in general, men tend to be stronger in terms of upper body strength. And so these tests definitely favored men, even if you didn't need to test exclusively upper body strength to see who was going to be a good police officer, because it's not like police officers are bench pressing suspects all the time. So again, you needed to make it more realistic, more connected to the job. If I want to have more women employed and disqualify a lot of men, all I have to do is set up a physical ability test that tests flexibility. Women are much more flexible than men. And so again, you can tamper with these physical ability tests, but most of them now over the last half century have been really tested, really challenged, and so most of them are pretty similar, and we don't see as much of a disparate impact. Even, as I just said with the Pennsylvania State Police, women were still close to that 80% passage rate, and there was really no reason why any woman or any man should fail that limited test that the state police were giving. Some of the common qualifications for police, we're not going to spend a lot of time on these because these are really, most of them are common sense, but age. So most police departments have a minimum age, maybe it's 21. Sometimes we'll see a little bit higher, but usually it's at least 21. Physical ability, we just talked about that, so you're probably going to have to prove that for most police departments that you have at least some good physical health. Mental stability, most police departments will at least somehow, either through a psychological test, and most of them aren't very good, to be honest with you, they're very general, so they don't really spot deep problems that a person might have, or maybe it's through an interview. They will test your mental stability. Do you have any glaring mental disabilities that might hinder your performance as a police officer? Do you have a clean record? So obviously we don't want to be hiring someone who has a serious criminal past. Now, I always have students who come up to me and say, when I was a freshman I got an underage drinking citation. Is that going to ruin my chances of ever being a police officer? And the answer is absolutely no. Be honest about it. When you fill out the application, report that you were cited for an underage violation, but that is never going to exclude you. I can't imagine, at least maybe there's some strange police department out there that would exclude you. Now, if you got that citation on your way to the interview for the police, so you're on your way to interview with the police and you are still not 21, you're only 20, and you had a few beers with you and you got arrested as you got cited as you were walking into the police department for your interview, that's not going to look good. But generally speaking, minor offenses, even drunk driving, things like that, even drug use, as long as it was experimental, and usually there's a waiting period. So if you use marijuana, for instance, usually they want you to have waited for at least 3 years to apply. So, you do have to think ahead. If you're going to smoke some pot, don't do it very often, and make sure it's only experimental, and make sure, it was a while ago. Education, um, typically most police departments require 60 credits. So even though the federal government expected back in the 1970s that by the early 80s every major police department would require a bachelor's degree as an absolute qualification for employment, that hasn't happened. Instead, most police departments require 60 credits. Some don't require any. And then if you have active military service and you're honorably discharged, you might be able to reduce it down. For instance, the state police used to require that you still have 30 credits of college if you were honorably discharged, but they don't even do that anymore. You don't have to have any credits if you were honorably discharged. Credit record. Some students are surprised that police will ask about this, but if you have huge debt, you have a bad credit history, so you've defaulted on a lot of bills or loans, and you have you have a mountain of debt, you probably aren't going to get hired because you're a risk. Because what happens if that drug dealer offers you a few $1,000s to look the other way? The idea is you might be more tempted because of your credit. Polygraph and honesty. If you are thinking about becoming a police officer, you're filling out an application, be honest about everything. Be overly honest. Because if you do have to go through a polygraph and it's discovered that you lied about anything, you will never be employed with another police agency. So even if you admit that you lied, and so this has to be a knowing falsehood. If you forgot about one of the names of your roommates from 10 years ago or something like that, that's an honest mistake. But if you knowingly lied or knowingly misstated things on your application or in your application, and that's discovered, that's an automatic disqualifier for virtually every police department that I can think of. You're not going to be hired anywhere else. So be honest. You don't have to be a perfect saint to be a police officer, but you do need that to show that you have integrity and honesty. Some police departments may require residency, not usually at the time of application. So if let's say you're a New York resident and you do want to be a Pennsylvania State Police officer, you don't have to be a Pennsylvania resident at the time you apply. But when you go into the academy, you do have to be a Pennsylvania resident. So you have to possess a Pennsylvania driver's license. That's proof of residency. Some police departments require that you actually live within their jurisdiction. So if you're going to be a Philadelphia police officer, they might require that you actually live in Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania State Police require that you live in Pennsylvania because obviously you have that Pennsylvania driver's license. But if you work in Philadelphia, you can live in Erie if you want and still be a state trooper. You just have to make sure you're there at work all the time and you're willing to drive those 3 or 4 hours or whatever it takes to get from Erie to Philadelphia. Citizenship is usually a requirement, so you have to be a U.S. citizen at the time of employment. This one catches a lot of college students. A lot of police departments have pretty strict tattoo policies. I keep going back to the state police because they have some of the most stringent employment requirements. And so for the Pennsylvania State Police, unlike for other police departments, some police departments allow you, if you have tattoos on your arms, they allow you to wear long sleeve uniforms even in the midst of summer. So if you want to work in Atlanta, Georgia, and 100-degree heat and humidity and 100% humidity in the summer and wear a long sleeve shirt, hey, you might be able to do that if your department allows you to wear long sleeves. State police don't. The Pennsylvania State Police will require you to put on a short sleeve shirt, and if any tattoo is showing above the neckline or below the arm line, you're going to have to get it removed if you want to be a state trooper. Now that could change, but for now, that's the policy. You don't have to get it removed until you are offered employment. So you're offered a spot in the academy. So if you have a nice, $5,000 tattoo sleeve, don't get it removed if you're just now thinking about becoming a state trooper. But realize that if you do accept that position in the police academy, you're going to have to get it removed unless they change their policies. So the bottom line for all these requirements for that last page is think ahead if you're going to be a trooper, if you're going to be a police officer, if you're going to be an FBI agent, if you're going to be any of these. Look at their websites, find out what they require, find out what the automatic disqualifiers are. These are the things that will automatically eliminate you from consideration. They will screen you out. So, a felony on your record is that's not that underage drinking violation, but a felony, you're probably not going to become a police officer. Significant drug use and hard drug use beyond experimental, that's going to likely exclude you. Lying on any application, that's going to exclude you. So a bunch of things can automatically disqualify you. Look at those and figure out what they are, and obviously avoid them. Don't get a tattoo until you're sure that you're allowed to have one for your police agency. So hold off on that. The typical hiring process, obviously you will need to apply somehow. So the application can be online, most likely it will be. You're probably going to have to fill out a lot of paperwork, so a lot of background information, a lot of information about your past, about your present, all those kinds of things. You're probably going to have to take a written test. I really encourage you, this is just a little bit of job advice. This advice was given by a former professor at Penn State and also by a recruiter who had that professor, a state police recruiter. And their advice was, if you're planning to become a police officer, take as many of these written tests as possible. So when you hear about some city giving a test for employment for policing, even if you don't want to work in that city, you don't want to work for that department, take the test anyway if it's convenient, because most of these tests are very similar. So this will give you good preparation for that agency where you really want to work. And so take some of these, at least a couple of these tests before you take the one for your dream agency. And who knows, you may find that if you take one of these practice tests, you may do well enough that you say, okay, I'll go to the next step of the process, and so on and so forth. And that's what happened to the state police recruiter. He was only taking the state police test because he wanted to practice. He wanted to work for some city police department. But he did so well in the state police test, he decided, okay, I'll go on to the next step, and the next step, and the next step, and he's made a career of being a state trooper. So, it might surprise you. You're very likely going to have to go through a physical and medical test, so you're going to have a doctor's exam. You may have to go through a physical agility test and also a medical test. You may have to do some psychological tests. So again, that could be a general written test, a multiple choice one. Sometimes they give general personality tests. These tests are not really designed to determine who's going to be a good or bad police officer, but the police department still give them because they think, well, at least we've done something to see if this person appears to be sane and competent. Other agencies, like the state police, will do a psychological evaluation with a psychiatrist or a psychologist at pretty much the end of the process, after they've conducted the background checks, after they've gone through everything else, so they can do a one-on-one interview with you to see if there's anything that was missed in the background. There's undoubtedly going to be interviews, or at least an interview, but probably interviews, and you're going to be asked ethical questions and all kinds of things during those interviews. Background investigations are going to take place. Depends on your agency how long they'll last. FBI, you're looking at maybe a year. The state police, Pennsylvania State Police, are trying to cut down because they really need troopers, so they're trying to cut down the length of time. It was typically 9 months to a year. They're trying to reduce that, but it can be a long process, and they're going to talk to not just your references, but other people as well. So when they talk to your references, they may say, can you tell me some other people who might know Jane or John Doe? And they'll talk to those people as well. So it can be, it's really in depth. You may have to do a polygraph. The Pennsylvania State Police have done away with this, and the recruiters don't like it. But to try to cut down on the length of the background investigation, the polygraph has been eliminated. So whether that's a good idea or not, I'll leave that up to you to decide.